All right. Well, since so is everyone ready to get going? Everyone? Okay, fantastic. Great. All right. Well, it's wonderful to see everybody on this beautiful sunny day. I hope everybody has been enjoying the conference. It's lovely to see people old and new from yesterday and see new people from today. So my name is Kirsten Fermaglich. I am in the history department and I've been helping to organize this wonderful conference. Before we get started, I want to thank everyone for attending the conference, for being here today. I would like to thank both the Center for Gender in Global Context, particularly the work of Stephanie Nawin and Emily Kahn and Katie Knowles and Lucy Thompson, people who have really put this together and made it really amazing. We obviously started planning this long before anyone knew how to deal with Zoom, but they have really regrouped and made it work, which has been amazing. Thank you to them. I also want to thank the Sterling Institute for Modern Jewish Studies and Israel for helping to co-sponsor this event, helping to bring Melissa Klapper and Lori Harrison-Kahan here, helping to pay for books of theirs, and also just to sort of help organize and publicize. I'd also like to thank Lisa Fine in the history department, who has also helped to co-sponsor, and all of the co-sponsors of this event. So thank you everyone for coming. I want to remind everyone, which it looks like everyone is, to keep yourself muted with videos off, even probably for the people speaking, except for when you're speaking. I think that will probably work the best. And then when it'll be Q&A, we'll have you guys come back on. And I think that is, so I'm going to be trying to keep time. We're going to go through the panel in the order that it is on your on the poster, and I'll announce all of our participants. While you're listening, please feel free to write any questions that you have. We're not going to ask questions after each talk, so we're going to have questions at the very end. So if you think of a question that you'd like to ask while we're talking, please feel free to write it in the chat. I'll be moderating and I'll be going back and reading all the questions. So, when you hear something, please feel free to throw it in the chat. Also, if you would like, when we're done, so I will introduce everyone, and then I will give their bios and the names of their papers. Then they will all read their papers in order, and then we'll get to and then Melissa Klapper will be our discussant, and she will give a discussion for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So at any time, please feel free to put things in the chat. After Melissa Klapper is done, if you also want to ask a question and you don't want to put it in the chat, also please feel free to go to the participants section of your screen, and you can see there that there's a place where you can raise hands. Please feel free to raise your hand, and that's another way that we can call on you to answer any questions. I think that's everything that I'd like to say. So I just want to say thank you again to everyone for helping to make this possible. Thank you especially to the organizers and the people who facilitated it and made it so wonderful. And now what I'd like to do is introduce our wonderful panel. I'm really excited to have been able to get everyone here together. So first, we are going to hear from Lori Harrison-Kahan. She will be reading a paper called An Anti-Suffrage Club, Jewish Women and Domestic Feminism in Progressive Era San Francisco. Dr. Lori Harrison-Kahan teaches at Boston College. She is the author of The White Negress, Literature, Minstrelsy, and the Black Jewish Imaginary, published by Rutgers in 2011. Received an honorable mention from the Society for the Study of American Women Writers Book Award. She edited The Superwoman, Woman and Other Writings by Miriam Michelson, published by Wayne State University Press in 2019. We were lucky enough to hear her talk about that yesterday. She's also co-edited Errors of Yesterday by Emma Wolfe, forthcoming in 2020. That's what she'll be speaking about today, I believe. And she is currently co-editing a collection of writings by suffragist author and editor Elizabeth Garber Jordan. Lori received the American Studies Association's Gloria E. Anzaldúa Award and the Western American Literature Association's Don D. Walker Prize, and I'm thrilled to have her here. The next paper will be read by Cassandra Euphrat Weston. The name of her paper is "The Information is Only to Mothers: Gender, Class, Yiddish, and Reproductive Politics at the 46 Amboy St. Clinic in Brownsville, Brooklyn." Cassandra is a second-year doctoral student in history and Judaic studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Her work focuses on the Yiddish left, broadly defined, in the early 20th century United States. She is a managing editor at InGweb, an open access digital journal and blog of Yiddish studies. And then finally, Hannah Green will be reading her paper, Able to Enter: Gender and Disability in Cecilia Razovsky's Immigration Advocacy. Hannah Green is a doctoral candidate in American Jewish History at New York University's Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, where she specializes in immigration, gender, and disability studies. Her dissertation, Able to be American, American Jews and the Public Charge Provision in United States Immigration Policy, 1891 to 1934, explores how American Jews engaged with discrimination on the basis of health, disability, and poverty in federal immigration law and its enforcement. She has taught courses at both the New School for Social Research and Cooper Union, published an article on disability and Jewish immigration in AJS Review, and has a forthcoming article, which I have read and enjoyed, on Lillian Wald's stance on birth control in the journal American Jewish History. And then finally, Dr. Melissa R. Klapper will be discussing all of these papers. Melissa Klapper is professor of history and director of women's and gender studies at Rowan University. She is the author of Jewish Girls Coming of Age in America, 1860 to 1920, published by NYU Press in 2005. Small Strangers: The Experiences of Immigrant Children in the United States, 1880 to 1925. Published by Ivan R. D. in 2007, and Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace: American Jewish Women's Activism, 1890 to 1940, published by NYU Press in 2013. It won the National Jewish Book Award in Women's Studies, and we were thrilled to be able to hear her talk more about it yesterday. Her newest book is Ballet Class: An American History, published by Oxford in 2020. So thank you all so much to everyone. I'm thrilled to be a part of this panel. And Lori, why don't you start us off?
I'm just going to share my screen. So let me set that up. Okay, it's wonderful to be back with all of you today. And I am actually not going to be speaking about Emma Wolf. I had to cut the parts of the talk that dealt with Emma Wolf in order to fit this into 15 minutes, but I'm happy to answer questions about Wolf and my new book about her and how that connects in with this material during the Q&A. So in my talk yesterday, I spoke about my book, The Superwoman and Other Writings by Miriam Michelson. I shared the story of how Michelson, a journalist, fiction writer, and activist, empowered women to fight for the vote. And this was at the turn of the 20th century. As we learned from Melissa Klapper's talk yesterday, Michelson was one of many Jewish women who were involved in the suffrage movement. Today, I'm going to take up a topic that is less often discussed at events marking the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment. When we think about gender, women's suffrage, and political power, our thoughts do not naturally turn to women who were anti-suffrage. But Jewish women were not a homogeneous group. They were shaped by differences of class, region, secular and religious identity, and political ideology. This talk will explore some of those differences by focusing on the example of San Francisco's Philomath Club. As the first Jewish women's club in San Francisco, the Philomath provided a space in which members could overcome barriers they encountered as women and as ethno-religious minorities. At the same time, the club's adherence to domestic feminism reified white privilege and classism in an attempt to align differences between its wealthy Jewish members and their upper-class Gentile counterparts. The vexed legacy of the Philomath Club demonstrates how conservative gender ideologies, including anti-suffragism, operated as an important form of political power for Jewish women. The origins of the Philomath Club date to 1893, when a woman named Betty Lowenberg, who was a San Francisco socialite, traveled to the Columbia Exposition in Chicago. There, she attended the Jewish Women's Congress at the World's Parliament on Religions. This event famously led to the formation of the National Council of Jewish Women, but it also inspired Lowenberg to take local action. Upon returning to San Francisco, she launched her own women's club, an organization for Jewish women who were excluded from the city's elite gatherings. The membership of this club drew largely upon the Sisterhood of Temple Emmanuel, and Lowenberg was very involved in the Sisterhood of Emmanuel. But we want to keep in mind that the Philomath was a secular institution and it had a strong literary bent. True to its name, its primary mission was study and learning. But through the choices of texts and topics, coupled with a collaborative enactment of upper-class social mores and performative acts of Americanization, the club accomplished a secondary mission. It made Jewish women an integral and visible part of San Francisco's bourgeois culture. Lowenberg tapped into a need among affluent Jewish women. The club's first open meeting, held at the luxurious Palace Hotel, which you see up here, in January of 1895, was a great success. One news report lamented that, quote, a more commodious hall was not chosen, as the room proved inadequate to meet the requirements of the large number of society people who turned out. And that phrase, society people, is telling. Designing the club with exclusivity in mind, Lowenberg believed that the club movement was not for all women. She cautioned that clubs should not distract women from domestic duties. And in one interview, she relates an anecdote about seeing a mother on her way to a club meeting. This is how she describes it. She describes the woman as crossing a crowded street with one child, almost a baby, hanging onto her skirts, and others in danger of their lives trying to follow. So it may seem strange for a club woman to raise this kind of hyperbolic alarm about the movement endangering women's children's lives, but her greater concern appears to be about class. She was actually pointing out that clubs were not for women without the means to hire servants who could care for their children. The Philomath Club may have created a sense of unity among some of the city's Jewish women, but in doing so, it used domestic feminism to police membership along class lines.
Lori, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We can't see your PowerPoint.
Oh, okay.
I'm so sorry.
What happened here? Okay, I'm going to stop my share and restart it and see if that makes it.
Okay.
Is it
there
working?
you go.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Was it on at all or not?
No, it wasn't.
Okay. 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 Yeah, I'm having a little trouble with the Zoom screen. Okay. So hopefully this will work.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry to have interrupted you.
No problem. Okay. So I'm sorry you couldn't see the previous slides. At the turn of the 20th century, women's clubs were often seen as a conservative force, devoted to maintenance of women's sphere and to the feminine ideals of proper womanhood. But in her book, The Club Woman is Feminist, which hopefully you can now see on your screen, Karen Blair argues that the club movement was a key moment in feminist history. For Blair, progressive and even radical ideas brewed under the ideological cover of domestic feminism, the notion that women's sphere could be extended to have a positive moral influence on public affairs. Such contradictions are evident in the Philomath Club, which promoted women's intellectual advancement while adhering to the cult of domesticity. So in reports of the club's activities, Lowenberg often stressed the conviction that the home, as she said, was the bulwark of civilization. Far from radical, the Philomath Club appeared to go a step further than other women's clubs in adhering to conservative gender ideologies. In deference to Lowenberg's opposition to suffrage, members were forbidden from discussing the ballot at their meetings, earning the Philomath a reputation as an anti-suffrage club. The club's rigid definition of femininity speaks to the ways that bourgeois gender ideals held additional for Jewish women. Because women's clubs divided along ethno-religious and racial lines, great wealth did not shield Jewish women from social exclusion. American-born, middle and upper class Jews were often classed with recent immigrants and seen as not fully American. By emulating Gentile society, the Philomath women aimed to prove their respectability using club practices to combat perceptions of them as foreign. For example, they undertook programs of study that exhibited their knowledge of Anglo and Western literature and volunteered at settlement houses working towards the uplift of new immigrants. Lowenberg also strategically sought out alliances and held reciprocity days with non-sectarian clubs. Bound by class, the women were further united through performances of Americanization. And hopefully you could see the image on my screen. I'm worried that it may have had something to do with when I switched slides. But this is from an article about a club breakfast hosted by the Philomath Club, where they invited other women's clubs to attend. And the article tells us, for example, that the papers included a panegyric on the United States, followed by, quote, musicians striking up the song America among much clapping of hands. Despite their assimilationist practices, the Philomath women maintained their ties to Judaism, in part because religious piety was an important component of 19th century femininity. As Anne Ruggles-Geer explains in her book on the club movement, minority club women moved, quote, toward an Americanization of their own making, one that included greater respect for diversity and appreciation for the contributions of all citizens. I'm going to challenge this idea to an extent. Yes, the Philomath women shaped national ideology by holding on to the identity that made their club distinct. At the same time, the club's practices and interreligious alliances entrenched class differences and came at the cost of interethnic and cross-racial solidarity with other minorities. The Philomath Club makes an interesting comparison to African-American women's clubs, which similarly mobilized a politics of respectability. In her book, Forgotten Readers, Recovering the Lost History of African-American Literary Societies, Elizabeth McHenry illustrates how Black club women became literary activists through their engagement with race literature. The literacy practices of the Philomath Club were more traditional. They only occasionally, for example, covered Jewish topics. In keeping with Geer's argument that women's clubs fostered the neo-colonialism of Anglo-Saxonism, English literature was a frequent topic of study in the club's early years, and their guest speakers were usually male professors from Berkeley and Stanford. The setting of the club meetings was also highly symbolic. One of my earlier slides gave you an image of the Palace Hotel, which would give you a sense of that. But they convened at the Palace Hotel, this very luxurious hotel in San Francisco, and their meetings became a site of conspicuous consumption. So I have up here an example of a menu from an 1899 meeting. Hopefully you could see it, and one of the things you may notice that this is definitely not a kosher meal that they were eating. Society page reports lingered on details of food, floral decorations, and fashionably gowned guests. Far from diminishing the intellectual rigor, the setting, along with the communal consumption of food and drink, transformed literacy into a social practice and gave it gendered meaning. Other women's clubs met in members' homes or in communal spaces like libraries or churches. For the Philomath, camaraderie was born not from the domestic space or the religious space of a synagogue, but from ties formed through the collaborative enactment of upper-class mores. The hotel setting indicates that the women were carving out a public space at the center of San Francisco's social and cultural life. Such elegant, tastefully orchestrated affairs offered women opportunities to show off their knowledge and talent as well as their material prosperity. The club women may not have renounced Judaism, but nor was Jewishness at the forefront of the club's identity. The very name of the club is important, right? It obscured its members' common religious affiliation, highlighting intellect instead. If the goal was to blend in, they succeeded to a degree. So when they were covered in the popular press, which was quite often, there were only occasional references to the club's ethno-religious identity. Yet there are also notable exceptions, and looking carefully at such moments offers insights into how and why the Philomath women sought to counter ethno-religious prejudice through their club practices. So I'm just going to give you two examples. The first one was an event that happened in 1897 that was widely covered in the press. You have up, hopefully on your screen, an article from the Los Angeles Herald. that covered this event. And at a club meeting, the invited speaker, who was a Berkeley theology professor, referred to all non-Christians as heathens. And according to this article, the women responded, quote, with murmurs of disapproval and whispered indignant comments. And then when he finished speaking, they promptly took him to task. The incident is telling for a number of reasons. The possibility that the professor did not realize he was lecturing to a Jewish women's club. The fact that the press defended the, quote, good Hebrew women and villainized a male scholar, and the outrage of the women themselves who banded together against male authority and knowledge. And here's just one more example. This is an article by Harriet Watson Capwell, which reported on Sadie American's 1909 speech at the Philomath Club, which was one of the rare instances when a prominent Jewish woman was invited to speak. American was a founder of the NCJW and involved in the Settlement House movement in New York and Chicago. Her speech occasioned scrutiny of the club's Jewish identity, exposing a complex and contradictory web of associations among Jewishness, class, gender, and region. As suggested by the title of the article, Capwell expresses admiration for the club, but the article also traffics in gendered stereotypes about Jewish women. So I'm just going to read you a little bit of the initial description of the club membership. How volatile and emotional the Jewish women are. A gathering of the New England women would not act as a sounding board for the most inspired speaker. Yet here was a speaker who would lay no claim to oratorical ability, and her audience smiled and sighed and brushed away a tear and leaned forward or settled back with climax and anticlimax. I doubt if any other women's club in San Francisco would give anything but attention stiff as buckram. This facile, pliable emotional interest is not in the average American makeup. The Philomath women are not the first generation on the soil, and they have been educated in your best schools, have traveled and lived and loved even as their most fortunate neighbors, and yet they have retained that gracious flexibility of feature, that abandon of responsiveness, which is part of the temperament which has given the world so many artists and musicians. So Capwell draws these distinctions between the Philomath women and other middle-class white women, as well as between the Philomath women and new Jewish immigrants. She acknowledges that the club succeeded in defying stereotypes about upwardly mobile Jewish women as overreaching in their mimicry of high society. So she goes on to write at the end here, one often hears that Jewish women err on the margin of overdress. They are sometimes pictured be-ribboned and be-chiffoned and be-plumed and be-jeweled. Diamonds are said to be as necessary to their makeup as marrow bone to a good soup. Capwell is questioning the credibility of such representations through her use of the passive voice, and then presents her first-person testimonial as a corrective. So it reads, at no afternoon gatherings have I seen such elegant restraint in apparel. These women serve as a rebuke to the notion that overdressing and jewels go by racial destiny. This is a portrait of successful immigration enabled by affluence. Still, anti-Semitic tropes lurk beneath the surface. She suggests that wealth and taste allow the women to overcome their racial destiny. The Philomath Club is the exception, not the rule. Capwell's article offers insight into the Philomath strategies of self-fashioning, reminding us that the club women downplayed their Jewish identity because Jewishness was deeply inscribed with a racialized and anti-Semitic meaning. Like many women's clubs, the Philomath grew from a literary society in the direction of civic engagement. And again, I'm hoping you could see this. This is from a 1923 speech that Lowenberg gave titled Then and Now, where she's reflecting on the development of the club over the years. And she states, universities do not train all their students to remain and to be professors, but send them out to grapple with the problems of the world. So when the founder was told the members of the Philomath wished to fly, the founder felt that was the greatest tribute that could be paid her, to fly from the nest, to be ready to go out into the world and do things, fill positions with honor and efficiency, brilliant children of her dreams. Speaking of herself in the third person, Lowenberg employs contradictory analogies. She is the founder of a male-dominated educational institution akin to academia, and she is also a nurturing maternal figure. This speech alludes to the evolution of domestic feminism in the suffrage era. Many club members had moved beyond the cult of domesticity to enter public life, including Lowenberg herself. By this point, she had published 3 purpose novels, which you should see up here, addressing a range of political and social reforms, used her platform to argue for the abolition of the Electoral College, and provided congressional testimony on the need for consistent divorce laws. Under Lowenberg's leadership, the Philomath Club created a vibrant secular literary culture. They broke intellectual barriers and ethno-religious ones, building a community in which they were largely accepted by the Christian majority. But we can't tell their story without considering how this anti-suffrage club shored up political power through classism and white privilege in order to write Jews into a national narrative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lori. That was really, really fascinating. We'll move on now to Cassandra Euphrat Weston.
Hello, all. Can you see my screen with the title slide?
Yes.
Great, excellent. In October 1916, 1 year after New York State's failed suffrage amendment of 1915, and a year before the subsequent successful state amendment of 1917, a cluster of women canvassed the streets of Brownsville, Brooklyn. Experienced birth control activists Margaret Sanger and Fania Mindell, as well as neighborhood volunteers like Rose Halpern, knocked on doors and passed out flyers in Yiddish, Italian, and English, announcing the opening of a new birth control clinic. Sanger, Mindell, and Sanger's sister, Nurse Ethel Byrne, operated the clinic for only 10 days at 46 Amboy Street with the intent of testing New York's anti-contraception laws, until police arrested all 3 and shut down the clinic. Activists used the clinic organizers' trials and convictions in early 1917 to mobilize unprecedented visibility and support for birth control. Eastern European Jewish immigrant women living in Brownsville, like Rose Halpern, both sought contraceptive information at the clinic and played a central role in subsequent organizing. Anarchists and other radicals, including many Jewish immigrants, had long promoted birth control, often through direct action tactics like arrests for illegally passing out birth control literature. But the Brownsville Clinic opened at a moment of transition as birth control gained traction outside radical circles. Scholars of birth control have rightly emphasized the coercive nature of this turn to a medicalized clinic model, but they have devoted less attention to the agency of patients themselves within these coercive structures. Recent scholarship on the Brownsville Clinic, including Melissa Klapper's wonderful book, has highlighted the central role of former patients, but has not given attention to their divergences in strategy and position from clinic organizers. Recentering the multiple forms of agency exercised by Brownsville mothers revises the history of the birth control movement in the United States from one led by middle-class American-born women. Instead, in Brownsville, working-class Jewish immigrant women forged their own strategies to advocate for contraceptive information within and despite the clinic structure. The clinic only accepted married mothers. Prospective patients had to share detailed personal information before they were admitted. After the Brownsville Clinic closed, some of these working-class Jewish immigrant women testified individually at the clinic organizers' trials, some under subpoena and some voluntarily. Some former patients instead embraced the political power of their collective identity as Brownsville mothers. Still others rejected the imperative of visibility to an English-speaking state audience. In all their actions, Brownsville mothers' strategies were simultaneously constrained and enabled by the reform nature of the clinic, by existing understandings of birth control within neighborhood and Yiddish political circles, and by their own positions as working-class married Jewish women with children. In 1916, Brownsville was a working-class, predominantly Eastern European Jewish immigrant neighborhood with strong radical currents. Although the clinic organizers' trilingual flyers also targeted local Italian immigrant women, Brownsville's Yiddish-speaking Jewish residents had the advantage of Fania Mindell's Yiddish interpretation, as well as Yiddish copies of the clinic's educational pamphlet. The same month that the clinic opened, the mainstream socialist Yiddish daily Vorwärts declared that, quote, "The question of birth control is now the question of the day. All interest themselves in it." Clinic patients described their eagerness to prevent pregnancy, the dangers of relying on inaccurate information from neighbors, and the inadequacy of expensive doctor's visits where it was hard to broach the subject with a male doctor who might not, in the end, even be willing to give them contraceptive advice. The clinic's bilingual operation, low cost, and women's leadership, together with its location and open advertisement, made it a uniquely accessible source of contraceptive knowledge for Jewish immigrant women in Brownsville. The Brownsville Clinic operated in line with a progressive reform ideology that sought to quantify and manage working-class immigrant women and their families. Mindell administered a questionnaire in English or Yiddish to all prospective patients, asking about each woman's reproductive history and her husband's employment, then recorded patients' answers in English. Mindell's questioning excluded women who did not meet the narrow parameters of the organizer's strategic narrative. Birth control was for married mothers who could not afford more children. The organizers also turned away women who sought abortions, sometimes after they threatened to commit suicide if they could not get help ending their pregnancy. When police raided the clinic to shut it down, they seized the meticulous patient records and wrote down the names and addresses of the 20 women present. Sanger and Mindell had expected a police raid and were defiant, but the patients were alarmed. As participants in an illegal venture, the women may well have feared legal repercussions and police harassment. Several days prior, many patients had refused to be photographed by a reporter out of concern for their husband's reactions. Police involvement similarly threatened patients' confidentiality, especially as a crowd of 1,000 people gathered outside the clinic. The prosecution used Mindell's records and their own notes of patients present at the raid to subpoena witnesses against the clinic organizers. The women faced a $250 fine and 30-day imprisonment if they did not comply. Thus, visiting the conspicuously illegal clinic and having their personal information recorded in English subjected Brownsville mothers to legal coercion and state scrutiny. As subpoenaed trial witnesses, women struggled to pay for transit to downtown Brooklyn and to care for their families over the course of the long trials. They could not find kosher food near the court for themselves or the children they brought with them, underscoring the hostile, non-Jewish nature of this state-controlled space. One woman told a reporter that she, quote, probably would be beaten up for getting into anything that kept her away from home all day, while another worried about the children she had left, quote, whether Jakey was playing with matches at home, whether Hanala was standing too close to the window, end quote. As lawyers and witnesses discussed the abstract benefits of birth control, Brownsville mothers risked domestic violence and their children's survival to appear in court. Their worry about fire was a realistic concern. Later that month, the Brownsville Labor Lyceum caught on fire with 600 children inside as panicked mothers congregated below. At the Brownsville clinic trials, although the defense blamed the prosecution for mistreating the Brownsville mothers by making them wait in court under onerous conditions, it was in fact the clinic's own record-keeping and deliberately illegal operation that had exposed these women to the difficulties of being summoned as witnesses. At the witness stand, former patients had to recount their experiences at the clinic and, at the defense's insistence, repeat their personal and family circumstances. After the prosecution questioned Fanny Stern, Becky Eisenberg, Dora Green, and many other women about visiting the clinic, defense lawyer Jonah Goldstein strategically cross-examined them with the same questions they had answered for the clinic's questionnaire. One witness testified to having had 11 miscarriages, quote, with tears in her eyes, end quote. Another woman's moving story of struggling to support many children on her husband's low wages prompted the judge to adjourn for the day. These witnesses overwhelmingly expressed support for Sanger personally and the clinic in general. However, they had no choice in appearing in court or in providing personal information for a second time, now publicly, unlike upper and middle class birth control supporters who could opt out of discussing actually using birth control themselves. As working class immigrant mothers subjected to scrutiny and management at the clinic, the Brownsville witnesses were subsequently compelled by the state to publicly share their use of birth control, and by Goldstein to perform poverty and emotional vulnerability. However, Brownsville mothers also employed a range of strategies to exercise their own political agency within these constraints. Many working class women attended the trial voluntarily. The Forverts emphasized the Brownsville spectators' rapt attention to, quote, how the court would decide the destiny of their families, end quote. An especially noteworthy commitment, given that many listeners were likely not fluent in English. Although they were free to leave, these women shared much of the hunger, childcare worries, and exhaustion experienced by women under subpoena. Their presence in the courtroom was visible and audible through their enthusiastic clapping and their babies crying, a pointed reminder of why they might be seeking contraception. By choosing to attend the trials, Brownsville's Jewish mothers and other working class women made their personal stakes known to the judges deciding the case despite the material challenges of the courtroom. Some former patients embraced the opportunity to speak about their difficulties raising large families on low wages. Rose Halpern, the former clinic patient I mentioned before, voluntarily testified for the defense and described her presence as a, quote, demonstration, end quote. Like many of the other Brownsville witnesses, she spoke with her 6 children around her, including a baby in her arms. Halpern was a Jewish immigrant originally from Vilna who lived in Brownsville. She had been enthusiastic about the clinic since she first helped Sanger and Mindell pass out flyers. Fluent in Yiddish and familiar with the neighborhood, she would have been a trusted face vouching for the clinic to her neighbors. Around the time of the trials, Halpern became the president of the Brownsville Mothers Birth Control League. In this role, she frequently represented all Brownsville mothers, such as in March when she spoke alongside many prominent activists at a dinner hosted by wealthy supporters. Halpern remained involved with Sanger's birth control advocacy for decades. She corresponded with Sanger, made financial donations, and gave legislative testimony at Sanger's request. Thus, Rose Halpern consistently embraced the strategy of providing personal testimony before an audience of state actors as a representative of working-class Jewish immigrant mothers. For many other Brownsville women, organizing as the Brownsville Mothers Birth Control League provided a path to political power through collective action. Identifying as Brownsville mothers allowed them to articulate their personal stakes in birth control in a general maternalist framework without the compulsion to share specific personal details. 25 women met at the former clinic space in mid-January, along with Sanger and Mindell, to form the League. Accounts of the new group and its emerging plans emphasize the women's collective visibility as a protest strategy, citing various plans for a, quote, parade, quote, demonstration, and, quote, march. Although these plans seem not to have materialized, Brownsville women did attend the trials together, as well as the Carnegie Hall mass meeting, where they sat on stage with their children in, quote, places of honor, in which they occupied a symbolic visual role as mothers. On the one hand, they were largely silent subjects of reform at a meeting led by others. At the same time, they attended by choice and embodied motherhood as a collective identity without having to divulge personal information. After the trials, the Brownsville League stayed involved with the advocacy focused on clinic organizers. They petitioned President Wilson to release Sanger from prison and gathered at a Brownsville subway station to travel into Manhattan for the dinner thrown by wealthy supporters at which Halpern spoke. As at the Carnegie Hall meeting, their collective identity could have helped combat the potential discomfort of being highly visible, perhaps tokenized, guests of honor at a lavish dinner. The League also focused on mobilizing, educating, and meeting women's ongoing needs within Brownsville. Although Sanger led the first meeting, it was Brownsville women there who suggested a parade in the neighborhood, perhaps in the model of the, quote, magnificent parade, as the Forverts put it, of unions and leftist organizations in Brownsville the preceding November. The League also hosted Sanger for a public speech at Independence Hall on Brownsville's bustling Pitkin Ave. One Brownsville woman, Sarah Goldstein, inquired about using the 46 Amboy Street space to organize against skyrocketing food prices, which she saw as an overlapping issue. Thus, collective organizing allowed Brownsville women to establish a personal and group identification as Brownsville mothers, through which they engaged both with external audiences and with their own neighborhood. Finally, attending to exceptions and silences in the archive suggests alternatives for Brownsville mothers' engagement. When the prosecution summoned Brownsville resident Alice Cohen as a witness at Sanger's trial, she testified, to the prosecution's surprise, that she had never been to the clinic or met Sanger. Cohen may have been mistakenly subpoenaed by the police. She may have been lying. She may have promised different testimony to police in advance. Whatever the explanation, the state's failure to extract the narrative they sought points to the agency Brownsville women may have exercised in choosing not to provide testimony. Most such refusals are invisible in the archive by their nature as silences. Alice Cohen's anomalous testimony offers a glimpse of the various ways former patients may have resisted or contested the imperative to publicly support the clinic, including by maintaining silences in the face of compulsion to divulge their personal stories. In addition, while the Brownsville Mothers Birth Control League enabled Brownsville women to collectively and publicly agitate for birth control, the clinic also opened new possibilities for organizing without such visibility. Former clinic patients could now share information they had learned about contraception, such as the use of pessaries, a diaphragm-like device available at a local drugstore, and the Yiddish or English pamphlets they acquired at the clinic. Such organizing would have drawn on the information provided by the clinic, but would not have been constrained by the clinic's reform ideology or the imperative to serve as a legal test case. Women's informal networks of reproductive health practices were particularly common among Jewish immigrants. Enthusiastic public organizers like Rose Halpern would likely have shared contraceptive information informally with friends and neighbors, but former patients who did not join the League may also have passed on contraceptive information they learned from the clinic, resisting visibility and prioritizing indirect rather than direct challenges to state power. When Brownsville Jewish mothers visited the 46 Amboy Street Clinic, they acquired concrete information in Yiddish about how to prevent pregnancy. They also stepped into a reform project that surveilled and managed them as working-class immigrant mothers, combined with a radical direct action that opened them up to state coercion and further scrutiny. However, these women exercised a variety of strategies for acquiring, disseminating, and demanding contraceptive knowledge within these constraints. Some of their political strategies aligned with the reform imperative of individual visibility as working-class mothers. Some instead embraced collective action and group visibility as mothers. Some strategies focused on Brownsville, organizing their neighbors with familiar tactics such as speeches and parades. Some avoided visibility entirely. Although Brownsville mothers often strategically presented themselves as a unified collective, disaggregating the many strategies they pursued recenters working-class Jewish immigrant women like Rose Halpern and Becky Eisenberg as political actors. The Brownsville Clinic thus returns the history of birth control activism to the hands of the immigrant women who publicly and privately insisted on being able to prevent having more children. Immigrant mothers' public participation in the Brownsville Clinic's political project was often coerced. Importantly, unmarried mothers and women without children were excluded altogether. But as birth control consumers, these Jewish immigrant women also shaped their own demands, put pressure on the state, controlled the terms of their visibility, and pursued many forms of political agency informed by their existing political and personal commitments. Further histories of the birth control movement must return working-class immigrant mothers to their rightful place, not only as passive subjects of coercive maternalist reform, nor only as eager supporters of middle-class activism, but rather as women dedicated to the pressing need to prevent pregnancies who built a variety of political strategies within the structures and positions they inhabited. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. That was fascinating. That was so interesting. Excuse me. And so our final speaker will be Hannah Green. So Hannah, you don't have any slides, so we'll just wait.
No, I don't.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you. All right. A series of questions confronted prospective immigrants who flipped through the first pages of Cecilia Razovsky's 1922 pamphlet, What Every Immigrant Should Know. In stark black and white text, it exhorted them to ask themselves not only how they could immigrate to the United States, but whether the letter and administration of the law would permit them to enter. Distinct from her tireless advocacy for immigrants' welfare and reform of American immigration policy, Razovsky took a pragmatic approach in What Every Immigrant Should Know, earning the approval of the Commissioner General of Immigration. Using the platform furnished by her position as the Executive Secretary of the National Council of Jewish Women's, or NCJW, Department of Immigrant Aid, she sought to accomplish two central aims in her pamphlet. Through cogently delineating United States immigration policies and procedures, she instructed admissible immigrants, with an emphasis on women, girls, and children, about immigration to make it as expeditious, affordable, and physically manageable for them as possible. Her guidance, however, extended beyond the process of immigration itself. Before prospective immigrants left home, Razovsky endeavored to help them determine their legal eligibility for admission to ensure that undesirable or inadmissible aliens may not be tempted to make the journey to this country, only to be rejected at the port of entry. Razovsky's background working with immigrant Jews and familiarity with federal policy qualified her for this project. What Every Immigrant Should Know responded to a recognized need for educational materials to advise immigrants about American immigration policy. In February 1922, representatives from NCJW participated in the Conference on Immigration Policy in New York City. The conference appointed a committee tasked with studying and publicizing information about immigration law, finding expert-driven solutions to the issue of immigration, shaping public opinion through the press, and fostering discussion about immigrants' welfare and the United States' national responsibility to them. In addition, it delegated a representative to Congress to learn about the state of immigration legislation and asserted the need for a nonpartisan institution to present unprejudiced statement of fact to Congress and to the public as a basis for just and humane immigration legislation. The committee's multi-pronged strategy accentuated the twin concerns of reforming immigration law and presenting it accurately to immigrants. Razovsky's What Every Immigrant Should Know, published in both Yiddish and English, focused on the latter of these goals. Neither critiquing nor endorsing the American immigration system, Razovsky treated it as a given and counseled immigrants accordingly. In simple fashion, it explained key tenets undergirding immigration law and provided definite instructions as to the physical, mental, and financial requirements of prospective immigrants. She warned them about the legislative obstacles they would encounter and refrained from mentioning lawyers and immigrant aid groups who intervened on behalf of immigrants turned away. Her bleak portrayal of the American immigration system rather dissuaded than encouraged immigrants considering whether to come to the United States, urging them to think long and hard about whether to chance leaving their homes and seeking America. What Every Immigrant Should Know offered systematic legal, bureaucratic, and practical guidance to prospective immigrants about whether and how to navigate labyrinthine immigration policy. From the outset, Razovsky depicted the harsh reality of American immigration regulation. She informed her readers that some people must never come and advised them to study her pamphlet to learn what kind of people may come to America and what kind of people must stay at home. Throughout her pamphlet, Razovsky underscored hurdles that women and girls would encounter and how gender influenced enforcement of the law. Where applicable, she pointed out lesser-known loopholes immigrants could deploy to their benefit. Women's gender occasionally worked in their favor, since only single girls over age 16 and widows not traveling with their parents needed to pass a literacy test. But because officials judged immigrants based upon their assumed ability to earn their own livings and contribute economically to the United States, women and girls faced stringent scrutiny. Officials demanded that widows supply documentation of their husbands' deaths. They labeled girls reported as too free with the men on shipboard as undesirable, effectively criminalizing them and leading to their rejection upon arrival. Women with young children had to present an affidavit demonstrating that a male relative could care for them to prove that they would not depend on charity from public funds. If an immigrant did require temporary aid, Razovsky included a list of organizations that offered short-term financial assistance, but immigrants could not rely upon such organizations to guarantee their admission to the country. Alongside its focus on gender, What Every Immigrant Should Know stressed the impact of health status and physical ability on obtaining admission to the United States. NCJW had long promoted its support of so-called defectives, or people living with disabilities and illnesses, to enable them to be self-sufficient. Its awareness of the effects that illness and impairment could have on individuals' lives translated into Razovsky's booklet. She repeatedly alluded to the public charge provision, which Congress first codified in 1882 and revised several times prior to her pamphlet's release, most recently in 1917. Entrenched in federal immigration law, public charge ranked immigrants based upon their perceived physical, mental, and economic statuses, regulating immigration along intersecting lines of impairment, illness, gender, and class. Effectively assigning monetary value to health and gender, it determined immigrants' eligibility for entry based upon perceived likelihood that they would depend upon public funds, whether because they might require medical care or because immigration officials assumed that they could not earn their own living. Beginning from the immigrant's home and culminating upon arrival at American ports, the pamphlet methodically delineated what prospective immigrants should anticipate at each stage of their travels, highlighting challenges they might face because of gender, illness, or impairment. Razovsky stressed that a variety of physical and mental defects posed insurmountable impediments to admission. She urged immigrants who might fall into such categories to get a second medical opinion if a steamship company doctor diagnosed them with a bad defect. If two doctors made the same diagnosis, she cautioned immigrants against coming to America at all, since many men, women, and children are turned back if they have bad defects. These included tuberculosis, trachoma, skin diseases, insanity, phoebus, feeble-mindedness, and venereal diseases. Parents needed to consider their children's health as well in deciding whether to travel to the United States to preclude family separation owing to debarment or deportation on public charge grounds. Razovsky emphasized that parents with a feeble-minded or insane child should remain at home or leave that child behind, because such children can never come to America to live. She took for granted the assumptions undergirding and motivations animating the law. Men and single women who are deaf or dumb or blind will not be allowed to come in, she asserted, because they cannot find work. Such people cannot earn a living for themselves and must ask for charity, and America will not admit paupers. The public charge clause commodified health and pathologized poverty, equating the real or imagined presence of impairment or illness with the inability to work and dependence on public funds. It constituted a short step from an immigrant's diagnosis with sickness of mind or body to their diagnosis as a pauper. Unmarried women faced a greater risk of classification as a public charge, all the more so if they presented any hint of illness, impairment, or pregnancy. Even if immigrants did not have an illness or impairment, if they appeared sick or disabled to immigration officials, that alone could justify their debarment and deportation from the country. Though it addressed all prospective immigrants, What Every Immigrant Should Know underscored hurdles that women and girls would encounter and how gender shaped enforcement of the law. Especially after 1917, unmarried women faced a greater risk of classification as a public charge. Physicians at Ellis Island subjected women to visual examinations to determine whether they might be pregnant and possessed substantial leeway in implementing diagnostic measures. One doctor affirmed that immigrant women's hair provided an excellent clue, since ordinarily the lock of hair on the left side of their heads was more or less lustrous, but would become dull and lifeless if they were pregnant. In 1921, Razovsky told her readers, the United States government deported many women because they could not pass the literacy test, sometimes used to judge feeble-mindedness. Razovsky spoke directly to young women traveling to their fiancés as well, suggesting that they contact relatives or NCJW to locate their betrothed. Upon request, NCJW would send one of 200 special committees located in cities scattered across the United States or Canada to visit these young women's fiancés and interview them about their plans for their future wives. Following their meetings, a representative from NCJW would then write to the bride back in Europe to advise her whether she should migrate to the United States to marry him. If her fiancé proved unable or unwilling to support her, officials might well designate her a public charge, shutting America's gates to her. Winning recognition from the federal government as a social service agency qualified to assist immigrants detained at immigration stations afforded NCJW the authority to mediate on immigrants' behalf and advocate for reform. Council representatives personally handled deportation cases at the intersection of gender, illness, and disability, a fact that remained conspicuously absent from Razovsky's booklet. Between November 1921 and November 1922, out of 218 women and children whom NCJW documented, immigration officials classified 32 as mentally defective, 60 as physically defective, and 17 as otherwise LPC, or likely to become a public charge. Razovsky pointed to the problem of the deportee, especially groups of aliens who are debarred from entering by virtue of their defects, persons who have arrived in excess of the quota, persons afflicted with favus or ringworm, tuberculosis or heart disease, insane and feeble-minded persons, and persons who, in the opinion of the immigration authorities, are likely to become public charges. She divided deportations into two main categories. The first included those deported because of excess quota, illiteracy, favus, and trachoma. These immigrants could return when new quotas opened if they learned to read or if they were cured. The second, a very tragic situation, one which is most difficult to solve, comprised those deported permanently because of diagnoses of idiocy, feeble-mindedness, insanity, and incurable disease. Such cases often culminated in family separation, physical and mental travail, and even death. Razovsky shared the story of a little girl deported because of her diagnosis as feeble-minded after she had lived in the United States for several years. The mother accompanied her daughter back to Europe, leaving her husband and other children in the United States. Councilwomen struggled to find a European institution that would accept the child so that the mother could return to the rest of her family in America. But by the time they succeeded in doing so, the child had died. After Congress passed the 1921 national origins quotas, Razovsky authored a report analyzing immigration policy and describing how council members interceded between immigrants determined to be public charges and government officials. She explained that the 1917 public charge provision that rejected persons afflicted with loathsome or contagious diseases or otherwise physically unfit, idiots, imbeciles, insane, or feeble-minded persons, illiterates with a few special exceptions, and persons who are likely to become public charges, contextualized the provenance of these quotas. Stories circulating in the press about the danger of contamination and spread of virulent diseases, superseding even fear of political radicalism, overpopulation, and saturation of the labor market, impelled Congress to limit immigration as strictly as possible. The quotas, Razovsky elucidated, did not emerge out of a vacuum. They functioned as a logical extension of public charge restrictions to reduce immigration. Razovsky drew upon her encounters with deportation proceedings to underline the importance of protecting immigrants from the anguish of debarment and deportation. Her firsthand knowledge of the physical, mental, and emotional turmoil that deportation unleashed for immigrants and their families framed her publication of What Every Immigrant Should Know. Deportation, Razovsky wrote, constituted a transnational problem requiring the cooperation of European Jews and demanded constructive educational propaganda to prevent the sailing to the United States and Canada of inadmissible aliens. If she ensured that immigrants had information that straightforwardly depicted American immigration policies and procedures, she could protect women, men, and children with little chance of admission from the trauma of exclusionary immigration legislation. She contended that thorough screening of immigrants at their ports of embarkation could prevent many of the kinds of deportation cases that NCJW witnessed. Since, she asserted, feeble-minded persons, imbeciles, idiots, and tubercular persons are certainly recognizable as such, this group of individuals could easily have been spared the long journey to America and the heartbreaking experience of being refused admission and returned. American immigration policy caused practical and psychological harm, generating fear and tension among immigrants and foreign-born citizens alike. Public charge remained a priority for Razovsky, evident in the statistics she cited of a reported 889 Jews whom the United States deported between 1925 and 1930. Officials deported almost a fifth of these Jews, either because they had become public charges from conditions arising prior to entry, or because they were liable to become public charges. Razovsky's comprehensive immigration work extended beyond the candid overview of American immigration policy that she provided in What Every Immigrant Should Know. As much as she encouraged immigrants to adhere to the law as written, she and NCJW continued to highlight and seek to mitigate its injustice. Though NCJW avoided openly defying what it termed the United States' traditional liberal policy of immigration control based on the physical, mental, and moral fitness of immigrants, it lobbied for the liberalization of both immigration policy and its enactment. Razovsky repeatedly drew attention to how immigration policy separated families, heightened the difficulty of naturalization, and threatened national unity because of how it reified the divide between citizens and non-citizens. What Every Immigrant Should Know constituted a single component of her programmatic immigration activities that combined the aspirational and the practical. Alongside her advocacy for legislative and bureaucratic reform, she kept in mind the immediate toll that immigration processes and procedures took on immigrants. Razovsky's awareness of the perils immigrants faced spurred her to provide them with the necessary tools to decide of their own accord whether they should come to America or whether they should stay at home. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Hannah. And we'll turn the floor over to Melissa to bring together these three really great papers.
Okay. So I'm very honored to offer some thoughts about the three wonderful papers we just heard as part of this panel on Jewish women, suffrage, citizenship, and sexuality. It's a testament to the efforts of the organizers of the Gender, Suffrage, and Women's Political Power Conference, and particularly to the efforts of our moderator, Kirsten Fermaglich, that Jewish women's history even has space on the program, as even women's and gender history conferences explicitly devoted to diversity do not often recognize the importance of Jewish women's history to that goal. But as these presentations amply demonstrate, Jewish women's history has a great deal to offer, not least a reminder that issues of intersectionality are greatly enhanced by consideration of Jewishness, whether defined as a religious, ethnic, or cultural identity, or as some combination of those factors. Taken together, the papers make a strong claim for centering American Jewish women's experiences in any discussion of gender and broadly defined political history. They also illustrate the sobering realities of multiple forms of anti-Semitism and the continued salience of considering anti-Semitism in both narratives and analyses of gendered formations of political power. In her paper on the Philomath Club of San Francisco, Lauren Harrison-Kahan provides a useful reminder of what should be an obvious point. Not all American Jewish women were the same. They were divided along the lines of ideology, class, national origin, religious observance, geography, and many other factors that differentiated their experiences from each other. From the outside, Betty Lowenberg and the other well-to-do members of the Philomath Club resembled the Jewish women I have written about who supported the suffrage movement in myriad ways during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A number of members of the Philomath Club belonged to other Jewish women's organizations, such as the National Council of Jewish Women and local synagogue sisterhoods, that did largely advocate for women's enfranchisement, even if they sometimes stopped short of formally endorsing it. This was, as Harrison-Kahan notes, a group of women recognized as cultured, educated, well-traveled, all descriptors of many of the middle-class suffrage activists across the United States at the time. Yet the Philomath Club did not support suffrage, and Lowenberg, its founder, took an active anti-suffrage stance. The club members felt secure in their positions at the top of the Jewish social heap in San Francisco. Still, even though the city was renowned for its openness to ethnic diversity, at least within the bounds of perceived whiteness, they still felt themselves set apart and acted accordingly to shore up their acceptance into general San Francisco society by adopting a political and social conservatism that they thought would preclude any lingering questions about their complete integration and what I'll call clubability. They deployed conservative gender ideology as a way to exert social and political power. It is worth noting that this strategy did not entirely succeed. The Philomath Club members were generally welcome in all precincts of San Francisco society as a practical matter. They were still seen as somehow other, something that Harrison-Kahan deftly shows through her analysis of news coverage of the club meetings, for example. This paper makes me want to know more, always a good sign. For one thing, Harrison-Kahan argues that the Philomath women held on to their ethno-religious identity, but I'd like to hear more about how they did so, other than hosting the occasional Jewish guest speaker like Sadie American, since that is not the focus here. For another, Lowenberg herself sometimes contributed an actively anti-suffrage point of view to the symposia on suffrage that American Jewish periodicals were hosting at the turn of the century. But did the Philomath Club actively work against enfranchisement in that way, or did the club just not take the issue up? And what happened when California enfranchised women in 1911, a huge suffrage victory that resulted from a campaign led in part by San Francisco Jewish women like Selena Solomons? It would be interesting to know whether changes over time to both California women's legal or citizenship status and the San Francisco Jewish community had any impact on the Philomath Club's maintenance of class privilege and traditional gender identity as strategies to preserve their status. Cassandra Euphrat Weston's paper also takes up issues of Jewish women, of course, in its investigation of the working class Jewish women, many of them immigrants, at the center of the first birth control clinic in the United States. Birth control activist Margaret Sanger deliberately chose the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn, hoping that Jewish women's pre-established interest in reducing their fertility rates would bring them to the clinic for the most up-to-date information. It is telling that while Sanger also wanted to provide contraceptive information to Italian immigrant women and did do so, she hired only a Yiddish-speaking clinic social worker, not an Italian-speaking one. Euphrat Weston is primarily concerned in this paper with keeping the clients of the clinic at the center of a narrative that she argues has been too focused on activist leaders of the birth control movement. This is a bit of a straw man setup, since as she so well demonstrates in the case of Rose Halpern, consumers of birth control were also activists and vice versa. What her extensive use of Yiddish sources does show, however, is the widely ranging reaction to the police raid and closure of the clinic on the part of the Jewish Brownsville mothers. Some, perhaps those with more radical backgrounds, though that would require further investigation, were pretty comfortable showing up in court to support Sanger, her sister Ethel Byrne, and Mindell, but others were not happy at all to be called as witnesses and to have to discuss personal information in public. A lingering question here, and quite possibly an unanswerable one, would be whether even the most uncomfortable women thought it was worth it in the end to gain access to contraceptive information. Yes, they were now being subject to state surveillance, but did they think about it in those terms? And since most of them surely knew that going to the clinic was illegal to start with, would it matter to them if they could gain more control over their family size? This paper suggests that the formation of the Brownsville Mothers Birth Control League was a form of collective action similar to other Jewish women's collective actions, such as participation in the kosher meat riots of 1902 or the rent strikes that were about to happen in 1917. These are connections well worth exploring, and they have larger implications during the last years of the Progressive Era, a time period when so many American women of all kinds learned the value of grassroots collective activism. This is especially important in the context of the medicalization of the birth control movement that Weston mentions, as there is a conflict between the elevated notions of expertise and the creation of collective reform movements during the Progressive Era. In addition, the material presented here leads to the really interesting question of whether there is something specifically Jewish, other than speaking in Yiddish, about the Brownsville women's activism. Did they work with or alongside the Italian women who were also present at the clinic? It would be interesting to consider whether working class motherhood as the basis for political agency could bring women of different ethnic and religious backgrounds together, as I have argued it does for middle class Jewish women in reform movements, at least to some extent. The Prospective Immigrants in Hannah Green's paper on Cecilia Razovsky's What Every Immigrant Should Know at first glance had much less control over their circumstances than either the Philomath Club members or even the Brownsville mothers. Yet Green shows that Razovsky helped them maneuver around US immigration rules related to public charge. This paper also effectively demonstrates the value of incorporating disability studies into immigration history and gender analysis. By the time Razovsky wrote What Every Immigrant Should Know in 1922, she had been working for years on immigration issues, especially under the auspices of the National Council of Jewish Women, which had made protecting immigrant Jewish women and girls one of its core programs since very early in its history. It is telling on several levels that the pamphlet was published in both English and Yiddish. Clearly, there were multiple audiences, including, of course, would-be immigrants in Eastern Europe, but also their relatives and communal leaders in the United States who needed to know the ins and outs of increasingly restrictive national immigration policies. As Green points out, the idea of keeping out those who might become a, quote, public charge was not new in 1922, and depressingly is still part of immigration policy today, but it had growing import in the wake of things like the Dillingham Commission's 1911 study of immigration and the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. Public charge was related to both poverty and disability. It had the consequence of pathologizing poverty and assuming negative economic consequences of disability. Jewish immigrants were certainly not the only ones targeted by these ideas, but the inherent anti-Semitism of much of US immigration policy had a major impact on their opportunities. Green explains that Razovsky did not waste her time deploring these policies, but focused instead on explaining how they would apply, particularly to unaccompanied girls and women who are presumed on account of gender norms to be unable to support themselves. Even the National Council of Jewish Women shared these gendered concerns about self-support and also about the special status of women who must surely need additional protection. These concerns may well have been practical. Clearly, Razovsky did mean to be helpful in counseling certain categories of prospective Jewish immigrants not to try to come to the United States. But they also reveal fault lines within the transnational Jewish community that could be teased out to further effect. What about significant transnational Jewish concerns about sex trafficking, for instance? Green is understandably quite focused here on what every immigrant should know and offers a great deal of useful analysis of the text, but questions linger about the way other American ethnic groups, particularly, again, Italian Americans, who also set up protective systems for women and girls, dealt with these issues. Also, did anti-Semitic ideas about Jewish bodies make the system of public charge particularly fraught for Jewish immigrants in particular? The larger project will need to, and probably already does, address some of these larger contextual issues in considering the intersections of state power, immigration, gender, and disability. Taken together, all these papers remind us of the rich and vivid political history of American women, a history that is best served by looking for agency and power as exerted by a very diverse array of women in the past, like the Jewish women we have heard about today. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much for these great papers. Actually, Hannah and Cassandra and Lori, if you guys want to turn on your screens too. Actually, I think at this point we probably can go to, we should go and have everyone sort of make themselves visible. We have a fairly small audience. So if people want to put up their videos. Thank you so much. These were great questions. And thank you so much, Melissa, for a really fantastic interrogation of the individual papers and then also comments on the papers as a whole. I wonder, we don't have any questions yet in the chat, so I wonder whether people want to sort of throw questions in the chat. And I actually want to give a chance to the participants to see if they want to respond to anything that Dr. Klapper said while we're waiting maybe for some questions. Is there anything that you'd like to sort of respond to or follow up on some of her questions? I thought they were really interesting, particularly, I mean, I actually didn't write down the questions that you were asking, Melissa, but I thought that some of them were really worth pursuing. Actually, I'll say to Lori, in particular, the question of California and what happened when California voted for suffrage. How did the Philomath Club respond?
Yes, so I think what's really interesting about this, and Melissa makes this point in her book as well, that even women on the anti-suffrage side tended to kind of embrace that moment when the 19th Amendment passed, but also in California when suffrage was granted earlier. And so we could really, I was alluding to that at the end with Lowenberg herself, but also just like one really important example is that Florence Prague-Kahn was a member of the Philomath Club and then becomes the first Jewish congresswoman from California. So there's evidence that, and I think what Melissa said as well is quite important about, it's not that they were kind of actively anti-suffrage within the club, but they were kind of silent, right? They made the decision, we're not going to talk about it, which suggests that there probably were divisions within the club on that issue.
Okay, really interesting. And I'll just offer a chance to Cassandra or Hannah. Would either of you like to sort of respond to any of the questions that Ms. Klapper asked? I was really struck by just, for all of these pieces, I'll say just the focus on class, which I think, sort of the intersection between gender and ethnicity and class was very, very strong running throughout all the papers. Obviously different, with different kind of, sort of layers and levels to those kinds of intersections. And, I think this was partially what Melissa was getting at, Cassandra, and talking about your work, is that all of them in some senses are in part about middle-class women sort of talking to working class women, right? Or sort of imagining what working class women are thinking or saying, and maybe the limitations of that or the fault lines of that. I wonder if either of you would want to sort of comment on that kind of, those kinds of fault lines within your work. That's to either Cassandra or Hannah.
I'll say that I really appreciated these incredibly helpful questions. Thank you so much for this response, Dr. Klapper. And I have primarily more questions than answers to your questions. There's a lot of directions for future research, but I think it's particularly helpful in thinking about this question of middle-class women speaking to working-class women and like archival availability and silences, and how to read silences, how to read against the grain, like working with the sources that we have, and who the subject is. I think that these are helpful questions in expanding the readings of sources, both that I have access to in our current all digital world, and also I look forward to, physical archives as well in the future.
I'm just going to jump in first of all and express my extreme sympathy with anyone working, including, I'm having problems of my own getting to archives now. So that's, that is an issue for all of us. I also want to say, I just want to add something, Hannah, I'm not trying to cut you off. You'll look forward to hearing what you say too. We also have to think about, who we're designating as what kind of class, because in a weird way, so for instance, Margaret Sanger and her sister Ethel they were not middle-class women. They didn't grow up middle-class women. They grew up in a very poor family. Partially, it was so poor because there were so many children in the family. And while they might have had some class mobility, Sanger, at least in this period, is still somewhat identified, or certainly identifying herself with a kind of radical left working class, and although she definitely shifts, her class status definitely shifts over time. That shift hasn't totally happened yet during this clinic moment. So on the one, to many of the women of Brownsville, she might have appeared as a middle-class woman. Certainly the way she presented herself, she can dress better than they can, definitely. But is she really, right? And that's, these are hard questions. And actually the same thing is true for Cecilia Razovsky in some ways. Where is she coming from? She's not coming from some, she's not she certainly would not have been a member of the Philomath Club in San Francisco. They wouldn't have looked twice at her, right? As a Eastern European from an Eastern European immigrant type family, she's not. So it is also kind of interesting, even within a discussion of class, to think about who's identifying whom as what. What do we do as historians, especially given what we might know about people's later lives, and what was the actual situation at the time? Okay, so I'm just throwing that in there based on what the very interesting comment Cassandra just made. Sorry, Hannah.
Oh no, that's absolutely fine. Thank you as well for your questions and comments. They were incredibly helpful. I really appreciate them. A couple of things that I wanted to address that you spoke about. One was your question about whether any kind of anti-Jewish bigotry informed US immigration law or its administration. Public charge in particular focused so much on the administration of the law because it was rather elastic. And depending on which iteration of the law we're talking about, immigration officials had considerable discretion to enforce it as they saw fit. So Max Kohler, who is an American Jewish immigration attorney, who took many public charge cases pro bono, also worked on Chinese exclusion, he spoke often about how immigration officials excluded Jews as public charges because of poor physique or poor physical development. And this they typically assign to Jews from Russia. So that was definitely something that happened a lot to Jews, especially to Jewish men. In terms of the question of class, I think about that a great deal. And I think that it particularly relates as well to the question of illness and disability, because one of the arguments that Jewish communal leaders consistently put forth is that no Jew has ever been a public charge because no Jew depends upon public money, because ever since 1654, when we first showed up here and we promised Peter Stuyvesant that we would support our own, we've held to that promise and we continue to do that. And so they were like, because it's all privately funded, therefore Jews aren't public charges, and so they should be allowed in. If they need temporary economic support, that doesn't mean that they're paupers. It just means they need temporary economic support, and don't worry guys, we got it. So I think that the issue of class really does play a dramatic role here, because the way Jews treated class compared to the way immigration officials, who may or may not have been Jewish, treated class differed dramatically.
Thank you so much. Also, I'll add one thing. Dr. Klapper, because of your interesting comments on Sanger's sort of mutable class background, class perception, the longer paper that this is an excerpt from also considers Fania Mendel, who's this really interesting figure, and a possible reading of this clinic episode as like a moment of class transition for her, and that has to do with, you know, she's involved in radical political circles before and after, but there's a language shift too. She's involved in English-speaking radicalism after and Yiddish-speaking radicalism before. There's more to say there, but I appreciate that push to think more extensively about class.
Okay, and actually I wonder, I mean, sort of it's making me wonder to bring Lori's people a little bit into this as well, and wonder about sort of the mutability. I mean, I think that's actually really, is a really fascinating point to be thinking about with both Cassandra and Hannah's papers. But I'm wondering about it with your paper as well, Lori, whether there's a way that these women are actually constructing themselves as more middle class, right? That this is something that they're constructing for themselves, that the club allows them. Is there sort of a way that that is an operable kind of term for your stuff as well, and that there's a way that all Jewish women at this moment are kind of using class or kind of constructing class?
Right. So when you say more middle class, you as opposed to kind of upper class?
Oh yeah, no. I just mean sort of whether they are. I don't know. I mean, actually, maybe I would leave that for you. I mean, class is obviously such a problematic term, right? And there's lots of ways to parse it. So maybe I'll leave it open and maybe just ask you to comment on the degree to which they are they are constructing class.
And I would also say that this is not middle class. This is really elite, right? It's upper class identity that we're talking about here. But it's, I mean, to speak to the malleability, right? They had to do all this work through their club practices in order to perform that class identity, right? No matter how much money they had, the performance was really important to this. So I think that speaks to the malleability of the class that we're talking about here as well.
I wanted to ask just a follow-up question to Hannah, just that I kind of thought about, and I might have missed it in your work, but I'm curious. Melissa asked about sort of the ways that Jewish identity might be intersecting with disability. And I'm curious how much gender intersects with disability. How much are women more likely to be seen as disabled, feeble-minded? Are those also categories that are intersecting in reality, or in the way that Cecilia Razovsky sort of portrays it or thinks about it?
Yeah, thank you. Definitely is the answer. So certainly pregnancy played a significant role in that women who were pregnant or who could possibly be pregnant or who were alone or who had young children faced a greater likelihood of being rejected as public charges. Additionally, women who couldn't read might be diagnosed as feeble-minded or insane or an imbecile, usually as feeble-minded, and so they might be rejected as public charges. Additionally, depending again on which iteration of public charge we're talking about, either within, I think it's 1 year, 3 years, or 5 years, it becomes longer as time goes on, from the date of entry, immigrants were still liable to deportation as public charges if they wound up in a public institution and could not prove affirmatively that whatever condition caused them to wind up in a public institution arose after they entered. So there's one story, the very short version is a young girl. She winds up in a mental institution, basically because she's homesick is what the source seems to suggest, but she's diagnosed as insane. And so NCJW on one side and Jewish attorneys on the other side jump in to say, she's not insane, you're forcing her to have feeding tubes and you're forcing her to stay in this institution. And so that is why she is upset. Look, she's responding well to arts and crafts and saying she wants to go home. So maybe let her go home. And they prevail, she's able to go home, but it was close. And there's a bunch of other stories, not quite to that degree, but similar stories. And particularly as regards insanity or feeble-mindedness, women and girls definitely faced a greater likelihood of falling into one of those classifications.
So we have a little bit more time. Anybody who wants to put questions in the chat, please do so. We have about 5 more minutes. I don't know whether the 4 or the 3 of you, maybe the 4 of you, want to ask any questions of one another. I want to give you like a space to be able to perhaps ask you guys questions. I mean, I do feel like these papers are to some extent in conversation with one another, certainly in the same time frame, definitely talking about intersections of gender and class. I wonder if I can ask you all if you have things that you'd like to sort of follow up or pursue for each other.
I'll jump in just to say that I think one of the things that these papers show so beautifully is the advantages of doing history on different levels. You know, the kind of really the micro level of Brownsville or San Francisco, and the more macro level of national immigration policy and what impact that has. You know, and it's all important, right? And to see how these different layers intersect with each other, how they have an impact on each other, you know, on individuals' lives, but also on policy. It's just, you know, they work together so well because they demonstrate kind of these different historical approaches, right? What kinds of narratives we write or we look for and how they affect each other. So I just thought that was yet another way in which these great papers work together.
Actually, you're reminding me too, Melissa, that I wanted to kind of pursue a little bit and the question that you asked a little bit about the question about Cassandra about sort of reaching out to Italian-American women at the clinic, and also thinking about Cecilia Razovsky and whether this is actually something that, you know, other immigrant groups might be reading. Lori's paper talked about sort of the relationship between the Philomath Club and other clubs, not Jewish, but I'm wondering if you all would want to sort of think a little bit about how the Jewish women that you're talking about are actually engaging with or being perceived by outsiders, not outsiders, but not Jews, other groups of people. For example, Hannah, do you know, did other immigrants read on Cecilia Razovsky's text? Was that something that was broader in the immigrant community?
So I'm not sure about other immigrants. I do know that Cecilia Razovsky was able to get particularly Christian middle-class women to support her work against public charge. By 1930, public charge became the primary way that the United States government excluded German Jewish refugees from the Nazi regime. And Cecilia Razovsky worked very, very hard with Francis Perkins, who was Secretary of Labor, to try to come up with ways to enable immigrants to enter under bond. And so she faced criticism that it was only Jewish women or Jews in general who cared about these immigrants. And so she got women like Carrie Chapman Catt to write to the government and say, no, Christian women care about this too, and you should let these immigrants in. So I know that on that level there was discussion, and then on the legal side, lawyers drew considerably from Chinese exclusion cases, and there was some crossover there. But in terms of on the immigrant level, that I don't know about, but definitely something I'd like to explore.
Yeah. Well, the St. Vincent de Paul Society had a network. It wasn't as big as the National Council of Jewish Women's Network, but they did also, you know, meet unaccompanied women at the docks and escort them to the railroads and have people in major cities to meet them on the other side and kind of check out what their circumstances were. They were also concerned. You know, they didn't want the Italian American community didn't want girls disappearing off to Argentina or you know, wherever the big bad boogie was any more than Jewish groups did. So I don't think, my impression is that their network wasn't quite as elaborate, because the National Council of Jewish Women really had quite the network going, but that it was another group, and these dock agents knew each other. You know, they would see each other literally at the docks. And so the Italian community was, you know, did have some similar concerns and had set something up, you know, again, based on gender norms, but in practice, really helpful to a lot of people who felt safer. Yeah.
And I would just say, just to give one example, because I mentioned the comparison to Black women's clubs of the era. And there was a moment where there were these debates going on in all the women's clubs about whether minority clubs should be admitted into the General Federation of Women's Clubs. And so the Philomath ultimately was, but most Black women's clubs were not. But in the Philomath Club itself, when they held those debates, most of the women argued that Black women's clubs should be admitted. So I think that's really interesting, because you're seeing this kind of element of, yes, they're kind of positioning themselves in terms of whiteness, but yet you're also seeing this way in which they recognize that their situation is similar to that of Black women's clubs.
That's really interesting. That's great. Cassandra, I'll give you a chance to address it, or no, we're at time, but you haven't gotten a chance to, so I'll leave it open to you, or I'll finish our time.
I'll say very briefly, that's a really interesting question that I am looking forward to exploring more, and I think that there's a like overlapping factors. The like Jewish women and Jewish patients are more visible in various kinds of historical records for a number of overlapping reasons, including the like number of Jewish immigrants in radical circles who were already talking about birth control for other reasons. The patients who are on the record testifying are all Jewish women, as far as we can tell. The like explosive Yiddish press, as opposed to the relatively smaller and less local Italian language press. But also it's interesting to look at the perception of these sort of foreign immigrants, right, from American-born reformers and Stanger's own writings and others. And we see Jewish women and we see general foreign. So we have, for instance, a like fake German accent written in sort of almost a dialect, right? And we also have Catholic women. So they're not identified as Italian, but they're identified as Catholic, and that would likely have mostly been Italian, but not necessarily. So seeing the like ethnic religious categorizations of Jewishness, linguistic, right? We see a lot, there's a lot of questions to explore there.
That's really fascinating, actually, sort of the different ways, different categories, like not only thinking about sort of mutability of class, but mutability of these kinds of ethnic identities and religious identities is really interesting too. Well, thank you all so much. This was a terrific panel. Thank you so much to the audience. Thank you so much to the discussant for putting it all together. I just really appreciated all of you. I was thrilled to be able to hear you, and this fulfilled all my expectations. So thank you from me. It was